materiality, right? Materiality is such an interesting subject in contemporary art, especially over the past 10 years. There has been so much interest in materiality and why artists are looking at more and more different materials to use, how materiality carries meaning into your work, how does it attract attention for that matter. So I just wanted to start from this quote by my colleague James Elkins here at the Art Institute of Chicago. I don't know how many of you know James Elkins, but he's a super accomplished art historian who's written over 30 books. I still don't know where James finds time to write, and he's very well known for basically whistleblowing issues in the history of art that are very important and nobody has looked at ever before. So in 2008, he basically noticed that materiality was really not considered seriously in art. So he said, there is no account of the materiality of physicality of an artwork that contains an argument about the limits of historical or critical attention to materiality, and therefore there is no reason not to press on, taking physicality as seriously as possible, spending as much time with it as possible, finding as many words for it as possible. So his argument basically is that in the history of art, art historians talk a lot about materials, but don't really focus on the power materials have to convey meaning or upturn expectations. And there's a reason why this is. I have to tell you, it's not just that art historians are dumb and they didn't think about it before. There's a tradition, especially in Western art, that has motivated this approach. And it's a tradition that we need to undo now, because we don't just use oil paint and bronze or marble in our works, but we actually think about the use and the meaning of materiality of a range that is inexhaustible. So it's super important to start thinking about materiality outside the realm of classicism. And I also wanted you to be aware of the work of Jane Bennett. Jane Bennett published a book a few years ago called Vibrant Matter, and it is part of the new materialism philosophical wave. So in Vibrant Matter, Jane Bennett shifts the focus from human phenomenology to objects and the agency that always emerges from them. Recognizing a new distribution of agency that surpasses the limits of anthropocentrism, the author argues may encourage the development of more responsible ecological politics. Now, Vibrant Matter is a very interesting book. It has come under a lot of criticism because clearly it's out there, it's trying to re-envision the world. But basically, according to Jane Bennett, no material is static and inert. Everything is alive, at least on the atomical level, and everything has power over other materials and other objects. So if this is an area you're interested in exploring further, I certainly recommend reading her book, which is actually very enjoyable too. Let's begin here.
Chicago is one of those cities where people are willing to try new things, and there's enough need that it could need the field of architecture to help solve it. And I think that's an incredible place to be. And it may be that 15, 20 years from now, when we've solved all of Chicago's built problems, Chicago can then look at other cities and say, can we be useful, Gary, Indiana? Can we be useful, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin? Can we be useful, Kankakee, Illinois? I think that philosophically, I feel that way about all things, that there's the core project, but the core project should always be producing a byproduct of generosity and possibility. The Arts Bank is first a building that was going to be demolished, and a couple days before the building was to be torn down, I asked the city if I could take a stab at restoring the bank, and now we'll use the bank as an exhibition space, music venue, space for archives, and a space where creatives can be and develop their chops. one of the things that's become clear is that there are these moments when there are the people who live on the block, and we would call them local. And then there are these other people who come to the block who are interested in the things that happen. That mashup is always very exciting because it's rarely that one kind of person sits at this table and another kind of person sits here, but people are like very excited to kind of mix it up. And while that seems kind of normal for Chicago, that's actually quite radical. So one of the things that's exciting about the way the biennial was crafted was that it really wanted to speak to the field, but also have the field speak to everyday people. And we're fortunate in Chicago that lots of everyday people use the Cultural Center and Millennium Park and the lake. That's awesome, but I think also the Arts Bank allows for other communities, especially here on the South Side, or people that would normally be outside of the design territory, to kind of imagine themselves and their lives as being connected to this field that for many may feel like something very distant. And so we've been thinking a whole lot about, like, what are the ways that we can make design and architecture accessible? And some of that is like, can we put it in your face? Can we make you bump into it? Can we talk in unexpected places where other things are happening, like the laundromat or the barbershop? Could we have a site like the Stony Island Arts Bank in the middle of the hood? Is it possible to net together one of the industries in the world that is in many ways a kind of intellectual thinking? It seems like you need a lot of money to even break into the vocation. Can we connect this to other people? And I think that the program, both during the opening of the biennial and maybe over the course of the next 2 years, will try to unpack that question of bringing more people that would be pedestrian to architecture into the fold.
Right. So really interesting start there. I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to see, to visit the Stony Island Arts Bank. It's an amazing place. The man speaking there is Theaster Gates, one of the most famous contemporary artists around right now. Certainly one of the most famous in the United States, very well respected in Europe, and his work is in many international collections. I wanted to start from this video. Hopefully, sorry, let's finish with my thought there. If you don't live in Chicago already and you don't know it, and hopefully next year you'll be able to come to Chicago for the Res MFA again, do visit it. It's really an interesting place. Like Theaster Gates said, it's an archive, right? So archives are made of materialities, slides, books, magazines, photographs. These are all objects that tell stories, not just through the content that they dispense, but also through the material that makes them, right? One of the reasons why I wanted to start here is because I find that clip very interesting when it comes to the idea of reach out to people with architecture and design, and almost kind of interrupt their journeys through time and places with that conception that you need to bring things to people. This is also an interesting idea. You know, I have a friend of mine who used to live in Chicago and used to run a very successful independent gallery, who at some point ran into an existentialist question that pretty much derailed what she was doing. She asked me one day, what is the exhibition for? And, you know, totally makes sense. What is the exhibition for? I mean, it's a great opportunity to slap your work on the wall. It's a great opportunity to display an object that we call art. But socially, what function does it really serve? Is there another dimension in which we could operate that doesn't entail slapping your painting or your photograph on a white wall? Does it matter that people see it in that context? And if so, why? And I think Theaster Gates has been very good at bridging different worlds. You know, what he does at the Stony Island Arts Bank, in a sense, count as art, but he also creates works of art that have to exist in the gallery space because they engage with the politics of the gallery space. And I am more specifically thinking about this kind of works that actually have their roots planted in his youth and childhood. You know, it doesn't come from money. And as a kid working along with his father who repaired roofs, just helping out, he developed this attachment to materials. And he realized that materials tell stories. They're never inert. You know, they're never just something passive that you bring, manipulate, and turn into something else. They oppose resistance, right? There is always this dialectic exchange between your hands and the material. And one of the things I find fascinating about these works that are kind of painterly and sculptural at the same time is that they're actually made with recovered floors from gymnasia in the south side of the city of Chicago. Now, you can probably recognize the lines that have been interrupted by the reorganization of the wood parts on the floor, the parquet on the floor. And for those of you who are into sports, you know how the lines on the floor on a field, on a sports field, exemplify the rules. There are areas where you can do certain things and areas in which you cannot do others. And to reconfigure them in the way that we see here into an abstract idea, in a way constitutes a political proposal of abolishing those rules, those limitations, those boundaries. That's what those lines are about. They're about boundaries. And when you think about disused gym floors on the south side of Chicago, you think about black kids playing basketball on these very floors that have now become art. And you think about their dreams, their aspirations, but also about the boundaries that society draws that are between them and other aspirations. So I find these extremely interesting, also from the perspective of community, you know, how these materials draw a specifically localized community into the gallery space. And you see that political charge, right? The pristine, beautiful, institutionalized, white gallery space that it's now been somewhat challenged by the history of these materials that have been around, they've been played on, they've been hammered and reconfigured by the artist to bring a piece of that story into a space that needs to know that story and needs to acknowledge that story. You know, Theaster Gates uses different materials, but there's also an ecological dimension to what he does, because these are all reclaimed materials that would have otherwise been lost and destroyed, or just at times not even possible to recycle them, so just wasted. I think it's incredible how he's writing history, but not in a passive way from the standing point of somebody victorious. He's writing a history of the present through the knowledge of the past and how the present needs to be reconfigured actively by us. And there you go. That's the other view. And I also wanted to show you this work. This is by Jefferson Pinder, who also teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm just going to give you a minute to read the inscription, the label here, because I actually photographed the label when I saw this piece, because I think it's intrinsic, the materiality is intrinsic to the meaning of the work itself. So I'm just going to give you a minute there to read it. There's so much here, right? And I'm probably not the best qualified person to talk about the smashing meaning that's being conveyed through this work, and how it speaks to Black people. But it speaks a lot to me too. You know, I remember seeing it, encountering it for the first time in the gallery space, and my jaw literally dropped when I read that the wood is from President Obama's inaugural platform. Never a piece of wood was charged with political value instantly so much. Do you see the difference it makes? If the wood came from somewhere else, like somebody's porch, it wouldn't be the same work anymore. Once we know that the wood comes from President Obama's inaugural platform, it just becomes drenched with dreams, ambitions, aspirations, liberation, change, you name it. There is so much into it. And there's, of course, the audio element, Sun Ra, and what Sun Ra as a musician and artist means to the history of the Black community and Black identity more in general. There is something really fascinating about Afrofuturism here and the shape of the mothership and the tradition of the mothership in Black culture and in the Black imagery, and the way in which it's been here reconfigured by Jefferson Pinder. I just think it's an incredibly charged work, and yet very simple, very humble in its materiality. And I really care to show you this piece because it really spells out clearly how important the history of materiality is. And of course, there's the question mark, right? Do we know for real that this wood came from President Obama's inaugural platform? Or is it enough that the artist tells us so? And do we know? So now I wanted to take you to this point. Transubstantiation sounds complicated, and it kind of is. It's a religious manifestation, a process, right, through which one material turns into another. And my argument here, which I talk about in my book, Speculative Taxidermy, which is also about materiality in art, is not just about taxidermy. It explains how we got to taxidermy in contemporary art more recently. I wanted to show you how classical art has really operated this idea of transubstantiation, changing one material into another, and in the process, sort of muting the power of materiality. First of all, white marbles, right? You look at your white marbles from Greece, Roman, and you think that white marbles are, I've always cast this idea of purity, this idea of pristine integrity, but actually white marbles were polychrome in Greece just as much as they were in Rome. And what happened over time basically is that the pigments have disappeared over these sculptures. You know, the rain, the elements have made it disappear, and nobody has taken care of repainting them. And by the time the Renaissance rolled in, people had forgotten about the real aesthetic value and quality of the classical sculptures that were made in Greek and Roman art. So this idea of whiteness became ever so important in Renaissance art. Think about Michelangelo's David, for instance, or what comes next, you know, the neoclassical sculptures of the 18th century. So why am I taking you here? Because, of course, the important materials that we see in classical art, bronze, marble, paint, were all expected to do something other than speaking about themselves. The materials are intrinsically muted, right? The marble looks beautiful, and it's about a pre-encoded meaning. It symbolizes idealization, purity, and a sense of transcending time, right? It's immortal, it's forever. And you can see it in the works that Canova made during the 19th century. Again, these sculptures were never painted. By this time, people have rediscovered that classical sculptures were, in fact, polychrome, but the fashion remains the same. The whiteness of classical sculptures proceeds undeterred. And the same applies to bronzes. Bronzes were also polychrome in Rome and Greece, but of course the paint would strip off over time. This is what we're left with. And in this case, it's the color of bronze, regardless of the tarnishing, that symbolizes this idea of idealization, durability, and something that again transcends the decay and the toils of the real world. As you can see, these materials, bronze and marble, when applied to art, have these pre-encoded meanings, and they're very, very simple, very to the bone. And paint has been pretty much put through the same oversimplification, material oversimplification of transubstantiation. When you look at paint, when it squidges out from a tube, you can see that it's a liquid material, right? And it's ripe with potentiality. But of course, in the history of art, it's required to hide its intrinsic materiality, so it doesn't show itself as the squidgy, wet, splashy material, but it's actually turned into other materials, hence the transubstantiation, right? Like marble becomes bones and flesh, bronze becomes flesh. Here we have paint becomes clothing, sky, floors. And that happens over and over. Look at paint taking on the semblance of the sky and flesh. Then this happened. I'm going to get a sip of water before I tell you more. Now, this is Degas and his little dancer aged 14. Now, usually it takes quite a bit of time to talk about this sculpture, and we also have it at the Art Institute of Chicago. So if the museum were open, I'd take you there and we could look at it. But first of all, I need to tell you that you can see the tutu is real here, right? And it's not the only real part of the sculpture. The ballerina also has a ribbon behind its head. And this is not even the one that Degas made himself. The one he made himself was made of wax. And it today looks very much like this one, which is actually made of bronze. And the ones that have been made of bronze actually date back to the 1920s, when the descendants of Degas organized replicas of the original, fearing that it would collapse and destroy, disappear over time. They didn't do one thing, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So the original one made by Degas is in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery. All around the world you will see the other versions made by the descendants in the 1920s in bronze. Now, this sculpture is not about a pretty girl, as most people assume, but it's actually about a failed ballerina. I actually made a clip specifically about this a while back. I like to talk about this work because it's politically very charged. Basically, ballerinas had to study their art of dancing from a very young age. They had to start usually at the age of 6, and they were all working class girls. And by the age of 14, their body would have changed so much that in most cases it wouldn't match the standard for the star of the classical ballet. So what were their options? Unfortunately, not many. The main option was to become a prostitute, and if you were lucky, the opera would still keep you to dance at the back of the stage to fill in the scene. And the girl that we see here, who was a friend of Degas, was a failed ballerina. The French used to call them rats, the little rats, because they were scoured around the back of the stage, filling in the scene. And this is basically a terrible tale of how an institution like the opera would build these ballerinas for entertainment and then dispose of them and actually open them to abuse when their bodies wouldn't comply with the expectation of classical ballet. They ran a very murky membership scheme that allowed very wealthy patrons to have access backstage, and apparently a lot of sexual abuse would happen backstage as well at the opera, and everyone pretty much closed an eye. The society of the time just condoned it. And Degas made this sculpture to make people talk. The tutu that we see here, the real tutu, was the slap in the face to classical art. No longer he was letting bronze and marble become the actual signifiers of purity and transcendence, but he brought the real material into the scene to tell people this is real, this is the reality of what we are experiencing. And people didn't like it. This was one of the most upsetting works of art exhibited by an artist during the 19th century. And to make matters worse, he used real human hair. We don't see the real human hair anymore in the versions that were made in the 1920s, but if you go to Washington, D.C., you can. So you can actually see why people were upset, why it gathered so much attention, because Degas wanted to tell people this is not a pretty sculpture. Sculptures have taught us to think about perfection and reality that doesn't exist here in the real world. I am making a sculpture that is making us think about the ugliness of the reality we live in. He also changed the face of the ballerina to make her a little bit uglier than she was, so to make people assume that she could commit a crime. At this time, the first studies on physiognomy and eugenics are circulating in Paris, and people have read on newspapers that somebody's propensity to commit a crime can be read on somebody's face. So the shape of your nose or the shape of your earlobes can actually suggest which crime you are likely to commit. In this case, people realized immediately that Degas was suggesting she would become a prostitute. So this is the first work of mixed media in the history of art. And as you've probably noticed, I'm sure you've seen this work of art before in museums and galleries, but no museum tells you the real story of this piece. It's just like too much, too long. You'd just rather let people pass by and think, a pretty girl, pretty ballerina by Degas, got it. No, political it was. Degas had a streak of irreverence. He stood by the oppressed, and he was somebody who had known hardship himself because he lost everything. His brother squandered the family fortune and he had to work to make a living. So there's something really interesting going on here in the relation between his experience of life, the experience of these girls who were exploited by the opera, and the reality of the materials, the realness that tells everyone this is a real issue. It's not this fantasy of classical art and purity. Where does Degas get some of his inspiration to play freely with materials? From African art, which has already arrived on the markets through colonialist routes in Paris, some of it looted, some of it purchased, some of it created especially. The picture is very complicated there. But you can see that African masks and African sculptures played with different materialities that were unknown to classical artists or even to the Impressionists who played with different approaches to art at the time. So they provided very important ideas on how the use of unorthodox materialities can actually break a tradition to say more, right? That's the idea. Marble and bronze weren't saying enough anymore at the time in which Degas lived. And of course, as we know, African art also informs the work of Picasso, the African masks that will become essential to the Demoiselles d'Avignon and other paintings that he created. There would be no modernism and modern art without the influence of African art and how the materiality and the design of African art inspired artists to give up all the classical tradition of the past. This eventually, in the case of Picasso and Braque, leads to the use of other materials in art, like, as you can see here, wallpaper as well as newspapers, and the creation of collage as well. You can imagine that if Leonardo had come back to life in 1913, he would have probably had a heart attack just glancing one of these works by Picasso and Braque. The idea of the irreverence, right? The irreverence of slapping a piece of paper onto the canvas and see what that materiality does to the rest of the work. And again, Hannah Höch, one of the most important and least talked about artists in the Dada movement. You can see here the father. She is suggesting, creating meaning that comes directly from the real world. This infiltration of non-classical sources, material infiltration in the history of art of the last century is amazing. Think about collage. I don't know if any of you works with collage, but collage and photomontage do very interesting things. They bring materials that have been already published or created by others into discourse. And in this juxtaposition, you bring the reality, the political and social reality of your time in dialogue with other ideas. So whenever you make a photomontage or a collage, you're actually mobilizing the materiality of the real world and bringing it into an arena that you are orchestrating. So they're very powerful statements. I also wanted to look at this statement by Greenberg. Clement Greenberg, as I'm sure many of you know, was the most powerful art historian of the last century, championing abstract expressionism and Jackson Pollock more than others. And he actually is also responsible for reconfiguring the materiality and the conception of materiality in art during the last century. He also said that realistic, naturalistic art, which is like the art of the Renaissance, where everything looks like the real world more or less, had disassembled the medium, using art to conceal art. Modernism used art to call attention to art. Now, what does this mean? It means that the way in which artists use materials in the modern period, in the last century especially, is designed to call attention to an expressive ability, that it's a dialogue between material and form. It's not the subjugation of material like it used to be. Think about the histories of art, even around the world. I don't just want to isolate Western art in this case, but the idea is to subjugate the material, to push it and squish it so that it does what you want it to do. It's about mastering the material so that it speaks about your desire. And it says, it ventriloquizes what you want to say until you master it so that it says what you want to say. But the dialogue between modern materials and artists is different. It's a confrontation. And it's not necessarily a conflictual confrontation. It's an acknowledgement that the material is not passive, but that it exists as an entity that you have to engage with, that it carries histories that you can't erase and that you can reconfigure, but that you have to acknowledge first. And this is not what Greenberg said, but it's the principle of it. His principle was that every medium should be truthful to the material essence of the medium, right? So sculptures should look three-dimensional. Paintings should look flat. Now, I also wanted to show you a few examples. At times I'm going to speed up a little, otherwise we can be here for hours again. Michelangelo Pistoletto was an artist who worked with the Arte Povera movement in Italy, one of the most important recent movements in Italian history. I love this work because it slaps in the face classical art and its idea of purity. Look at the Venus there, the goddess of love, in her beautiful marble proportioned body, and the fabric, the clothing that she has next to her, juxtaposed to this avalanche, the cacophony of rugs, right? These pieces of fabric that speak of consumerism, poverty, utilitarianism, almost engulfing this Venus. You can see how he has actually brought the purity and untouchable quality of classical art, this untouchable, pristine preciousness of classical art in dialogue with the trash of us. Right? The rugs represent us. They represent our messiness, our society, our livingness, our being present dirty here, right? There's something really powerful, I think, about this sculpture. And again, Michelangelo Pistoletto worked with mirrors, again, trying to bridge this separation between the work of art and the the viewer and the world inhabited by the viewer. These are stainless steel polished panels with screen prints applied onto them. And basically the outside dimension, the dimension in which we exist, is always implicated in the painting as we see them here, because the painting constantly reflect what happens around them. So the meaning, the content is never just in the work of art, but it's completed by the presence of the viewer, again, something that materiality can accomplish. And also Marisa Mertz was the female leader of the Arte Povera movement, and she made this beautiful biomorphic sculpture made, as you can see, called living sculpture, but yet remained untitled. It's made of aluminum strips that she placed together. They almost look like air ducts, and they move in the air when there's an airflow in the gallery space. They're never exhibited in the same time, so they keep morphing and changing. This is something bronze couldn't do or marble couldn't do. It's a utilitarian, a poor material. Sorry, I didn't even say, I don't know how good your Italian is, but arte povera means poor art in Italian, and it was a fantastic movement that started in 1967 in northern Italy that aimed to challenge the history of elitism, of classical art and art, Western art more in general, in order to bring the messiness of the real world into the gallery space. I also wanted to talk about materials that come from the body, and Anna Mendieta, which I'm sure you know. Her work, Body Tracks, in which you can see blood being smeared over the wall or over a piece of paper, which creates a work of art that is unique, one of a kind, and at the same time extremely visceral. What does it mean to work with blood, right? It's not the same as working with red paint. So these are all questions that we have to ask ourselves, and always wonder, what histories does my material carry already in the making of the work itself? Which narratives can I not mute, even if I wish? Or which narratives can I not afford to be unaware of as well? San Juan did this performance in New York called My New York in 2002, in which he basically beat Lady Gaga at this, I'm afraid, with this meat suit. And it's basically a kind of anatomical reconstruction of the human body he wore to try and suggest the idea that he's wearing his body inside out, right? He's basically flayed himself to become hypersensitive. This is a work that usually causes a lot of controversy with animal rights activists. Don't like it because it seems like a big waste of steak. But at the same time, it tries to communicate a sense of vulnerability and a sense of sensitivity and empathy. The artist said that he visited New York after the events of September the 11th, and he was still shocked, palpably aware. Sorry, he was very aware of the palpable tension and feeling of devastation that still existed among people. So wearing this suit, the flesh, the bare flesh, made him feel connected to that sense of vulnerability, that sense of unease, the idea that you couldn't quite return to New York as a tourist and just not somehow try to partake into this suffering, into this process of vulnerability. And of course, you know, the suit is heavy in itself, it's wet, and it smells. So to walk around the city of New York for hours with this on was a statement about endurance, which is something that San Juan does exceedingly well. Here's our Piss Christ, once again, immersion. Now, the materiality here is key. There's something important about the use of urine. We mentioned it earlier. Some found it offensive. Until you know the title of the title of the photograph, The picture looks pretty lovely, you know, quite frankly. So it's fascinating to see as well how revealing the materiality at play in a work of art can change our conception. And you can decide as an artist when you want to reveal the material you've used so that it surprises the viewer or make them change their mind about what it is that they already saw. So I find it really fascinating that until you read the title here, your conception might be wholly different. Back to Arte Povera, I wanted to show you this example by Mario Mertz, who was the partner of Marisa Mertz. This is called Lingotto, and it's in reference to the building of that belongs to the Fiat automobile company in Turin, where Mario Mertz was born and where he lived most of his life. There's something interesting about the way in which you can use materials to represent, even in a more traditional way. This is his own representation of Turin. Turin is on the Alps, and you can see here this metal structure that elevates this ingot made of beeswax. Now, traditionally, beeswax is a material that's been used in different practices as a precious material. It also has a golden color, so it works well in that context to represent wealth. And it's surrounded by these very bare, very unforgiving branches that have been gathered together. They represent the agricultural reality around Turin, which is far from welcoming and giving and generous. So you can see here how the materiality of these objects that have been gathered by Mario Mertz speak volumes about a biographical history. The beeswax that represents the Fiat building at the top is essential to the understanding of the fact that so many people in Turin at the time worked at the building and worked at Fiat. So it was basically what the economy of that specific city relied upon. And Mario Mertz's father also worked there. Again, another iteration, as you can see here, of a similar idea. And these beautiful trees by Giuseppe Peano. This is about the materiality of something that's been actually already impacted by process. So as you can see here, we have these beautiful trees, right? They look as if they've been taken off out of the woods and just cleaned off a little so that the bark has been stripped off. But the reality is very different. Giuseppe Peano was another important artist of the Arte Povera movement. Bought himself some beams that had been industrially already shaped into the beam shape. And he then proceeds to carve out a younger tree from the beam itself. So you can see how important it is that he works with real wood, that he works with trees of a certain age that have been already cut to become beams. So they have been turned into a utilitarian object that is part of the architectural domain, and he's trying to recover nature, right? It's trying to dig nature out. And of course, the tree is dead at this point, so it's a poetic gesture, but it's fascinating to see how the process of carving out the wood is actually changing the meaning of the wood itself. You can see here different perspectives and how minute, how detailed they are. Again, Pino Pascali here using very primitive carved objects that suggest the idea of agriculture. And I just wanted to return back in time, just to kind of give you a different idea of how different art movements and moments play with the notion of materiality. Object in 1936 by Meret Oppenheim. It's cap and saucer covered in fur. Sometimes this generates feelings of abject in people. The idea of tea or coffee on that saucer entering your mouth. There is so much about this work when it comes to the materiality and the juxtaposition of awkward or incoherent, seemingly incoherent materiality. Of course, Meret Oppenheim is a surrealist artist, so To make the everyday strange was the surrealist recipe for everything, right? There's something fascinating about how certain materials can produce a sense of disgust. And it's in that sense of disgust that we find our own boundary. Why am I disgusted? What is it? Is it the animality that this work implies? Think about tea, coffee, the rituals of the educated, the rituals of the upper classes traditionally, more often at the time, moreover so at the time in which Meret Oppenheim lived than today, where everyone pretty much drinks coffee and tea. But covering the saucer, the teaspoon, and the cup with fur brings back this idea of rawness, this idea of untamed. And there's so much and so little at the same time here. You can see how, again, the materiality is what makes the work powerful. And she played with the notion of fur and femininity as well more than once in this work here, where you can see how these gloves, this kind of mittens, fingerless mittens made of fur, suggest this just the position between femininity and the fragility of femininity and animality itself. And since we're on the subject of animality, as we draw near an end, I just wanted to mention this. You know, Rauschenberg's monogram at the very end of the 1950s is a tour de force of materiality in art. You can see how we progressively face this unresilient, not a good word, we just face this kind of turmoil in artistic creation, where artists are no longer interested in just producing a pretty picture or an ugly picture. They want to create something in which history from the outside world is brought into the gallery space. And in this case, you can see how monogram plays with taxidermy and gathers different materialities, like the tire and this platform that it sits on, which again, as you can see here, has some paint over it and some photographs, some imprints. Monogram has remained the most mysterious of works of art. It perhaps is a self-representation, a self-portrait of the artist, Rauschenberg. It has been interpreted in so many different ways as a sexual reference as well. But you can read this work as the pure manifestation of the power of materials to disorient and to decentralize the human, right? That's what allowing materials to speak ultimately does. It puts us in a kind of secondary position, and it asks us to silence ourselves momentarily to try and think, what do these materials say before we make them speak, right? And you can see here, again, what is the purpose of this paint smothered on the face of the goat? Is it a joke about abstract expressionism? Is it the impossibility of representing something realistically like classical art would have done using paint anymore at this point in the history of painting, because we feel that everything has been accomplished in that department? And I just wanted to close this lecture with this work by a contemporary artist called Steve Bishop, called It's Hard to Make a Stand. Again, It's Hard to Make a Stand takes up a whole chapter in my book, Speculative Taxidermy. And I fell in love with it when I saw it in 2009 at the Saatchi Gallery in London. It's very interesting. And I don't know that I have enough time to really do it justice. Because to really appreciate it, you need to get your head around a number of issues involving animals and our relationship with animals as well. But as you can see, this is basically an equestrian portrait, right? The sculptural part, you know, that kind of white marble, it looks like white marble from a distance, horse. It's actually not white marble, but it's a polyurethane model of the kind taxidermists use to stretch the skin. That's what's under the skin of taxidermy mounts. You buy them, right? He didn't sculpt it. He bought it from one of these taxidermy supplies that produces them in different sizes, so you can order them the right size. Let's say you've got a horse, it dies, you really love the horse, you want to preserve it as a taxidermy mount, you measure it very carefully, and then you tell your, you look at the catalog of the supply shop that sells these products, and you find the right size, and then a taxidermist can stretch your animal hide right over it and create a very lifelike copy of your horse. The cellophane that you see around that sculpture is actually the cellophane that came with the horse. I interviewed the artist a while back, and he told me that's what the horse came in, you know, when I bought it. But then there's this fur. Now, when you see that fur, that's been basically just flung on the head of the mannequin with this kind of like careless, you know, here it is. That fur does something really interesting, because we have basically here all these materials coming together, speaking to each other, and outlining a history of animal subjugation that's really powerful. You kind of start thinking, what animals do I see here? I see a horse, right, because that's clear, but I also see a dog. I don't know if you see the horse, the fur, and the shape of a head of a dog there. It looks like a hound, perhaps. Of course, it's kind of nondescript. And then there's the animals in the fur itself. You know, what are those animals? The artist actually said he doesn't know what they are, but it's probably mink. And it kind of brings in another layer, another dimension of animal subjugation. How have we subjugated horses? Think about the tradition of horses and power. People who think that riding horses is fun for the horse, I'm afraid, I'm sure the horses would have better things to do. They do develop a bond after they've been broken in and bashed and they have lost their identity. I'm sure many of you know that horses, to become tamed, the taming and domestication processes involve violence. And in horses especially, the process is very gruesome. And that's only half of the picture, because we've also done violence to horses by crossbreeding them with varieties and breeds that basically have made their bodies vulnerable to deformities and malformations that now impact their health and happiness. So there are many ways in which we have actually not done horses a favor over time, and how we've actually used them as objects. Then think about dogs. So many of you have dogs. Dogs have been domesticated for over 15,000 years. And, you know, we think about them as lovely, lovely animals, and they are, but are they animals? Dogs have actually been programmed to love us, right? We have selected not just the looks. Think about it, it's one animal that looks in so many different ways, not because it has evolved differently naturally, but because we have crossbred and selectively singled out certain strands of behavior and certain aesthetic strands to make dogs look and behave the way they do. We haven't been quite as successful with cats, which is the really interesting part. But anyway, so there you have again another animal, a domesticated animal that has been objectified by us and turned into something manipulated by us. And then of course the mink that's turned into fur. It's the totalized animal, right? It's not even a companion. It's an animal that's been objectified so much it has become a material again. You can't even see its shape, right? You can barely see the horse, you can barely see the dog, but the animals that end up into the fur have been dismembered and they become little handkerchiefs of fur that are sewn together to create a human body, a human form, or a wearable, if you like, which is, you know, the epitome of anthropocentrism and the epitome of objectification. So at that point, when we identify these animals, all based on the materialities and shapes, think about the polyurethane of the horse that gives it away that this is not even a grand sculpture or anything that's worthy of being preserved, but it's actually a mannequin for something else. The cellophane represents the ghostliness of it all, the kind of capitalist essence, and at the same time this mass-produced quality. You know, it's like the horse is mass-produced as well. It doesn't come out of a factory, but breeding and cross-breeding these animals, it's the same kind of material. It's the same process, right? That the cellophane wraps up and underlines. It's this idea of chain production, this idea of manufacturing in a way or another. Then we turn to the title. It's hard to make a stand. And that's when the whole thing unravels. What is it hard to make a stand about what? Well, is it hard to make a stand about defending domestication, defending the violence that it's embedded in domestication, defending the objectification of animals in our lives? Or it's hard to make a stand, as we see here. Well, you see the stand is right there. It's made of wood. Now, Steve Bishop has a wicked sense of humor. And actually, when I interviewed him, he said, it's half and half. You know, part of it's about the stand and how hard it was to make, because the rest came done, right? So the horse mannequin was done, the cellophane I just unwrap and dump on top of the sculpture. The fur came from a thrift store and just flung it on. But the base he had to make. And there's something very interesting about the base itself. See, this is another angle where you can actually see the perspective, and you can see the dog manifesting itself. But there's this, right? You can see that for as much as things look haphazard and improvised and very light-hearted, the materialities that are part of this work are very carefully considered and very carefully put into conversation with each other. So the plinth here, the stand, is deliberately looks cheap, right? Like that's plywood that's being assembled. The steps suggest this idea of grandeur, right? It's part of the vernacular of the equestrian monument, the elevation. But then there's this kind of gilded veneer. This is a veneer. So he decided deliberately to expose this mirrored veneer for what it is, and the underlying surface that supports it, which is this plywood. This is reflective. So when you look at the sculpture close up, you can see the underbelly of the horse. And to the artist, this actually is a sculpture about vulnerability. The vulnerability of all these animals that we have domesticated, subjugated, objectified over time, coming together into one and becoming a monument that already smacks of obsolescence. It's a kind of wrong monument. What are we celebrating? You know, what is there to celebrate in this contorted relationship with animals? And the pedestal itself, that which is meant to elevate this contorted relationship with animals, which we most often claim is based on love, reveals the underbelly of the sculpture itself, reveals this vulnerability, right? In a way that also entails a linguistic dimension. To wrap up today, I just wanted to look at this incredible work by Kara Walker. I'm just going to get this clip to play so you can actually hear the artist talk about her relationship with this project and materiality itself. And I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts that you might want to mull over.
Kara Walker's work deals with history. Embedded in that statement Kerouac dealing with history is this kind of desire for a hero who can fix this problem of our history and racism. And I don't think that my work is actually effectively dealing with history. I think that my work is kind of subsumed by history or consumed by history.
All right, what do you want? We want to work from the back forward. Back. They lay out 14, 24, 34, 44. Okay.
Leto Thompson from Creative Time. He said, "You have to see this. This place is totally filled with molasses. Molasses on the walls, molasses on the rafters, globs of sugar 50 feet up in the air, just left over from this refining process." It was such a cathedral to industry and such a cathedral to this one commodity. The whole project is predicated on this space being demolished at the end of the run of the show. I had to learn more about sugar in the process of trying to understand this building. Sugar comes from sugar cane. Sugar cane is grown in tropical climates. Sugar cane is and has been harvested by slaves, underpaid workers, and children possibly. It's a fascinating and very long history. I started putting down all of my free association ideas, starting with sugar and molasses. Molasses is a byproduct of the sugar processing. What other byproducts are there? And I got to the end and I was like, ruins, you know, it was just the ruins, everything was just in ruins. And I couldn't just produce ruins. In this book I was reading about the history of sugar, contemporaries describe something called a sugar subtlety. I love this term. A subtlety is a sugar sculpture made out of sugar paste, marzipan, fruits and nuts that was, sculpted to portray royalty and only could be consumed by royalty, nobility, clergy. The subtlety presents this opportunity to make a figure that can embrace many themes, that is representative of power in and of itself.
Wow. Wow.
I was sort of grasping at too many different ideas that I wanted to bring into the piece.
Like, what don't you want it to look like?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I've never done anything like this before,
Yeah.
so I don't really have like a really good opinion, From ruins to the sugar subtlety, that led me to think about what sort of figure and what sort of position would she occupy. I think there was a moment of stepping back and ding, oh, what about a sphinx? It was very subtle, actually. It's not a kind of Egyptophile relic. This is someone from the New World.
Yeah.
I was not at all secure about doing sculpture. This was one of those things that was so out of my league that I hung back during the sculpting process.
We started with a clay model. The model was scanned and digitized and created into a file that could be read by carving robots. It's simply one layer goes on top of the other. You always hear about sculptors liberating the figure from the block. We go back in with the bow wires and basically drag the bow wire across the blocks at angles in order to achieve the curvatures that we're looking for. No matter how incredible robotic carving is, the hand is an element that you can't get away from, and it's beyond the hand. It's not just the hand; it's what's driving the hand.
Yeah, well, some of the material might be underneath.
We're in the process of doing our first test, so we're still very much in the discovery phase. I've done a lot of smaller tests, some 12-inch figures, but nothing 5 feet tall. So it's a mixture of corn syrup, sugar, and water, kind of like what you would use to make caramel or lollipops. So we're boiling it up to between 265 and 290 degrees Fahrenheit. We're pouring them into a rubber mold to let them set. So when we demold them, they will be covered in the sugar and water mixture similar to the Sphinx.
I highly recommend a 50-pound bag of sugar for personal therapy, but if you mix it with a couple gallons of water, it's very fun. I mean, it's the most fun I've had since kindergarten, I think, making art. I think it was very important to me to have figures made out of a substance that is so temporal, it's so subject to change. I really recognize what a privilege it is to be working in that space, because I can think of 1,000 other artists who could take on the challenge of that space. I really love the fact of these figures kind of melting and dripping, and they're very much like the interior of the Domino sugar factory, which is also still dripping, still producing molasses from its interior, still sort of weeping the substance. The mammy, although she's bent over in this gesture of sort of supplication, I don't feel like she's there to be taken or satisfied or abused in any way. She's sort of withholding. I don't want to make her into a non-sexual caretaker of the city. She's powerful because she is so kind of iconic in a way, and she is so monumental and so unexpected. If I've done the job well, then she gains her power by upsetting expectations one after the other. So I think it's very important to look back. I don't think we do it often enough. I think sometimes looking back leads to kind of depression and stasis, which isn't good. But looking forward without any kind of deep historical feeling of connectedness, it's no good either.
Okay, here we are. Just want to bring back an image, like maybe a meaningful image from this beautiful clip. I think it's really important to hear Kara Walker talk about the process, but also the importance of materials in our work, because there's no better source, first of all, but also because it's important to consider the amount of work that goes into finding the right material and then transforming or manipulating that material into something that will deliver a message that you intend. I find that most the connection between sugar and slavery, it's pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people don't really think about it in our everyday lives. And to be honest with you, before this work, coming from Italy and then having lived in the UK for so long, it didn't really occur to me when I was making coffee that this history is actually still present in the material, even if the sugar is grown and obtained in different ways, still involving exploitation, environmental as well as human. But it's fascinating how a work of art like this, once you digest it and once you have spent time with it, will impact the way in which you think about something as commonplace as sugar, and how it can recover a past history that's been made invisible by our history teachers and culture in general, and create a monument. What I like about this work is this idea again of monumentalization, of something that has been swept away and that has, it's a fundamental part of the history of the world, not just of the United States, with serious ecological and humanitarian implications that Kara Walker, I think, brings to focus and brings to our attention with an incredibly poetic and beautiful creativity. There's something interesting about the site specificity here that I wanted to highlight. And then, of course, I'd love to hear more from your perception and impression of this work. But the place this was held at was at the Domino Sugar Factory in New York, in Williamsboro, and like Kara said, the place was demolished soon after the show was over. Now it wasn't demolished as in dismantled entirely. There's luxury apartments now in that place, and there's something interesting about the history of the building, right, which is connected to the materiality of the sugar, and how both of them could be considered to be materialities. She's not just working with sugar that she brought into a gallery space. In this case, the sugar refinery is part of her materials. It's not just the setting, and the building comes with its history, and the material that she explores lives within the very architectural structure of that building. There's something really fascinating about extending your conception of materiality, not just to what you bring into a space, and thinking about the space, the gallery space, as a container for a narrative that's induced by a materiality reaction, but actually think about the synergy, the histories, and the materialities that bind material products to the places in which they were produced. So maybe in a sense this work speaks to the monumentality of Pennone as well, Giuseppe Pennone, and the trees that are recovered from the process of industrialization and returned, albeit poetically, into a natural form. So here we are at the end. There is a lot to consider between the first lecture and the second lecture. A lot of material. I hope it makes sense in one way or another with the readings. As I said earlier, don't feel like everything has to sink in right away. Sleep over it. Sleep is the best way to learn and let meaning sediment in your mind. You ever wake up in the morning and the first thing you say is like, yes, I got it. That's it. That's what it was, right? Sometimes it takes 20 years for that to happen. So be patient. Contemporary art is meandering, and it's about getting lost. That's the important thing to remember. It's not about finding answers ever. And never get tired of that. I get people are getting very tired about it right now. They feel like, oh, but why can't art give answers? Say, okay, some art might want to give answers. Religious art gave answers, right? Like the art made during the Middle Ages was entirely designed to provide answers. Art that was made during the Victorian period was designed to tell women how to behave, right? The whole of classical art was designed to tell us what to do and to tell us truths that we have to believe. So that's why modern and contemporary art goes like, I'm not doing that, I am posing questions and questions and questions. And the more I question, the more hopefully the viewer will find their own answers. And we can find our collective answers. We can bash them around, but it's so refreshing and good to know that there isn't one answer to get to at the bottom of it all. That's why at times artists don't agree with the readings of other artists of their work or with the readings of art historians, and that's fine too. An art object is a think tank. It's an arena in which to play out and perform, right? It's a place in which we can examine and reconfigure the world. And in the best circumstances, that reconfiguration and examining leads to action out there and a reconfiguration of the world out there, right? But the art object might not necessarily include that element in itself. So I hope this makes sense. I hope you enjoyed, and I so very much look forward to your comments and submissions to the scroll. Enjoy the rest of your week.